Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and AP English and our study of the World of Ideas text. We are in now lecture number 6, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. What I have argued for a number of years is the single most important essay of all time. I mean, think about the significance of what we're saying here. You wouldn't be sitting here in some, I think, really profound way if it wasn't for this essay as a work of persuasion, as a work of political statement. I think it's powerful. Now, I have said this for a number of years in 303, and I'll now say it again, and I really believe it. There is this mantra, this idea, that your generation is somehow fundamentally flawed, and one of the reasons it's flawed is because you lack patriotism. I see some of you already kind of smiling. This notion, of course, is now ubiquitous that your generation lacks the necessary belief in your country. You're not patriots. I have said to you that I don't believe that that's actually true. In fact, I think it's quite false, and I think a whole lot of the stuff that's happening right now in our country is kind of evidence and proof of that. But I will say this, and I've said it for a long time, and I always say it as I get ready to talk about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. If it is the case that you lack patriotism, and we'll come to that question at the conclusion of our lecture, I don't think it's your fault, because I don't think you're born a patriot. I think you have to choose to be a patriot. And I think the reason that you choose to be a patriot is because somebody gives you a good reason to choose to be a patriot. And I have said for a long time that I cannot in any way doubt what I'm about to say is true. It's as much of the epistemological absolutist position as I'll probably come to. But I'll say it this way. If you're not a patriot, it's because you haven't been shown the appropriate reasons to be a patriot. And I think the study of a text like the Declaration of Independence, and we have a lot of others. I mean, in this text, for example, I can't help but argue that if you have really read and understood Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, you can't help but stand up and take pride in your country. I would say the same is true of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is very important. If you have not already watched and flowed my earlier lecture that I have given on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, you need to go right now to learnstrong.net, and you need to find that lecture. It's provided right there in the World of Ideas folder, as well as in the Learn Strong folder of the junior year as well, where I've lectured in detail on the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to do that here because I've spent so much time doing it elsewhere. So my first assumption of a number of assumptions in this lecture is you have watched that lecture and you have that background knowledge. I will be commenting particularly in this lecture then on the stylistic and rhetorical devices that are so important. And while I comment on them in my other lecture, I'm going to really focus in here. There are some other key assumptions, obviously. Our learning theory and that a desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways is central, as well as, of course, the notion that we do that through our annotative process of answering the 3 guiding questions. Level 1, what does the text say? Level 2, what does the text mean? And 2a, we mess around with our big 5, as we call it. What does this text say about epistemology? What does this say about ontology? What does it say about psychology and sociology, as well as theodicy? We'll get to all of those at the end of this lecture. At 3b, we are looking at the rhetorical techniques as they're outlined in the Jacobus volume, and we'll have more to say about that in a moment. Finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3a, we're obviously going to ask, what does the Declaration of Independence have to say to, for example, Lao Tzu's views of governance in the Tao Te Ching, or, for example, Machiavelli's view of governance in The Prince, or as we just finished with Rousseau's comments and the social contract notion. Okay? And no question, Rousseau had a huge influence on the thinking of Thomas Jefferson and, of course, a number of the other colonists of this day. Our chief focus, as we say here, is to concentrate, though, there at that rhetorical level. We'll finish with that level 3b question, how can I relate to this information in meaningful ways? I do have a concern, and I've voiced it with you guys before. I do have a concern that a growing number of you guys have decided there's no point in really understanding an idea before you decide to get rid of that idea. We have said we're the stories we tell, we retell, the stories we accept and the stories we reject. And I know that a number of you have said, I think I'm just ready to be done with a lot of these ideas, but I again challenge you. Before you decide to be done with an idea, you might want to give some serious consideration to the idea. The other challenge, of course, in reading the Declaration of Independence is just how well written it is. Again, our chief view here is the Rhetorical Techniques. We know that this is in fact an edited document by John Adams and Ben Franklin and the Continental Congress. Jefferson said that, quote, this essay had been scored and scratched like a schoolboy's exercise, end quote. We know that this is a highly edited document. For example, in the original version, Jefferson, who ironically owned slaves, actually attacked the notion of slave trade, right? And we have said before, and we said this in our prior lecture on Declaration of Independence, that it's one of the bizarre ironies of American thought, American history, that paradoxes can be embraced like the one that Jefferson would own slaves and yet would be adamantly opposed to the slave trade. I think that a wise study of history sees all sides, right, and then learns to appreciate before simply condemning, and I'll try and make the same argument here. Let's focus now on some of the rhetorical techniques and the, in my estimation, the single greatest exemplar of persuasion that one can find. Go back again to my earlier lecture. What it was that Jefferson was suggesting, again, as we say in our earlier lecture, imagine going home and saying to the people who have raised you, sit down, I need to speak with you. Two things. One, I very much appreciate what you've done for me. Two, I need you to leave, I'm taking over the house. And everything will be mine in the house. And from the moment you leave on, you and I will be seen as co-equals. Can you imagine actually trying to do that? As I commented in my earlier lecture, to be able to do that and pull that off is one of the single greatest rhetorical feats of all time, which is why I argue this essay. Guys, it has to be read. It has to be ingested. I don't think you can look too many times at this essay. Let's do some quick biography just to remind ourselves. Jefferson, 1723 to 1826. 1800 is a good working round date for Jefferson if you're looking for those round dates. 1776, Adams, Franklin, the Continental Congress are going to produce this amazing document. The style of Jefferson is the reason that he was chosen, and Jacobus says this in his opening comments in the volume. 1779, Jefferson is elected to governor of Virginia. From 1790 1793, Secretary of State, and then of course he works as Washington's VP from 1797 to 1801. And of course in 1801 he becomes president, and maybe one of the most important things, he was involved with the Louisiana Purchase, 828,000 square miles west of the Mississippi for a meager $15 million, right? Some have argued, and Jacobus argues this, that Jefferson is without question one of the most versatile Americans of any generation. 1819, Jefferson always said this was one of his greatest accomplishments, was the founding of the University of Virginia. No question, very influenced by Rousseau's Republican philosophy and the idea as well of how that notion of men are born free but are everywhere in chains, so important. For example, just look on page 74. And the last paragraph of this introductory set of comments. Despite the revolutionary nature, I'm not just reading Jacobus with you, the ideas Jefferson expressed in the Declaration of Independence were not entirely original. Rousseau's Republican philosophies greatly influenced the work. When Jefferson states in the second paragraph that, quote, all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, end quote, he reflects Rousseau's emphasis on the political equality of men and on protecting certain fundamental rights. Go ahead and go back to Rousseau's essay, the beginning with paragraph 39 on page 63 of this volume. Jefferson also wrote that, quote, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, end quote. This is one of Rousseau's primary points, although it took Jefferson to immortalize it in these words. And no question as well, of course, the influence of John Locke we've commented on in our earlier lecture as well. Now, when we turn to Jefferson and the rhetorical techniques, I like to often begin with a line that was Jefferson's line. He said it this way about the Declaration. He said, quote, I did not consider it any part of my charge to invent new ideas, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent, end quote. Now, I think this is a compelling idea, because what we're saying is that Rhetorically speaking, Jefferson was taking ideas that he felt were common knowledge. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And he was going to present them in so forceful a way, persuasive writing, that he's able to at least make the reader have to pause for a moment. Remember what we said in our earlier lecture. Good persuasion is not about changing somebody's mind or opinion. That is a very difficult thing to do. But rather challenging them to at least consider their position. That is to say, to promote epistemologically the falliblest position. Now, what are the key rhetorical techniques that we are looking at? Well, obviously one of these is the periodic sentence, right? That is to say, the long, the carefully constructed and balanced sentence that is ostensibly the first paragraph, as we talked about it in our previous lecture. We also, of course, have causal analysis here, no question, used often in legal writing in Jefferson's day. Let's not forget that among all the other things Jefferson did, he was, of course, trained as a lawyer. The balance and the parallelism of the first sentence, right, and of the second paragraph is a classic exemplar of the rhetorical techniques. Think of it, right? Sentence length. We talk about this when we do our Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. See, I'm convinced that there's 3 documents that you have to know well if you're going to understand what it means to be an American. I said this in our junior lectures. You can go to learnstrong.net and find our junior folder and see these arguments made at length. I think you have to know this document, the Declaration of Independence. I think you have to know Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I think you have to know Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. All 3 of those documents come together with profound simplicity, especially when studied as a trinity, and I think they are a fairly powerful rhetorical trinity in American thought. Notice that in both Gettysburg Address as well as in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, Jefferson and this declaration is going to be referenced. It's powerful stuff. But notice the sentence length issues here, right? So, for example, you have a varying of sentence lengths, hypercritical, and the parallelism as well that's going to link words in repetition, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That repetition of the word that over and over again. Or, for example, the enumeration or the listing that will happen in the 3rd through the 29th paragraphs, outlining the causes, right? Now, you want this word in your notes. I don't think I mentioned this so much in our first lecture because we weren't just concentrating on rhetorical techniques there. Here we are. Anaphoria, write that term down. It's mentioned by Jacobus. We want to make sure we know what it means. The repetition of certain words at the beginning of successive lines. We, of course, know about this because of our study of Whitman's Song of Myself. Go back to the AP or to the junior folder on learnstrong.net and see our comments there about this. Anaphoria is going to be very well used here. Notice in those paragraphs 3 through 29, we have the repetition of 2 powerful, again, words, almost like mantra. He, blah, 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 blah. For, blah, 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 blah. Notice the he, of course, is Britain's George III. The dates there, again, 1738 to 1820. But notice, George III never actually mentioned by name, which is, of course, brilliant, because what Jefferson's trying to argue is that we are, in fact, fighting not against just an individual. We are fighting against a conspiracy, a despotism, a tyranny, if you will. Of course, the for part of this anaphoria is the grievous acts of the king, no question, and of course, Parliament's allowance of those acts. Now, why would he do this? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is to show the patience of the colonies, no question about it. And of course, the other is to tell the world, to inform the world, a candid world. You'll remember, as we saw in our earlier lecture, that we have in fact lost patience. It's over. Now, I'm not the first one to point out that this essay is divided up nicely into 4 parts. I'm interested in the second part. That's where we're actually going to begin. Again, because of my assumption that you've already studied with me the Declaration of Independence, I want to go on page 76 of your Jacobus volume to the middle of the second paragraph, because I think this is the heart of this entire document. Begin reading with me prudence. Prudence indeed will dictate. Prudence, wisdom, understanding. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. We have said many times in 303 that when we put our timeline lecture up on the board and we decide that Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon poem, is the first evidence of English poetry, English literature in 1000 Common Era, by the time Shakespeare's writing To Be or Not to Be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind, blah, 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 that's 1600. Dude, that's 600 years later. The British have 600 years of history between Beowulf and Shakespeare, and clearly they have a whole lot more literary and political history after that. Hear what Jefferson is saying. I think this is critical to understanding the rhetorical technique and the organization of this essay. You don't wake up in the morning and just say, notice he calls it for light and transient causes, let's just get rid of our government. In other words, Jefferson is making the argument, as we say in our previous lecture, we do not have a choice. We would like to continue to consider ourselves members of the British Crown. We don't have that choice. Notice that conceding of a point will now be set up as we talked about it in the previous lecture. Those two elements of consideration of the historical precedent when in the course of human events, blah, 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 and the conceding of a point, saying something to which you know the acrimonious audience will agree, go back to our earlier lecture, and accordingly, to finish now the conceding of a point, and accordingly all experience, the historical precedent, has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, our discussion of theodicy and the notion that life is, the Buddha called it dukkha, or suffering, right? Then to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed, right? In other words, people will put up with terrible things for a really, really long time because they love their government. Of course, we said before, when you're going to concede a point, you always follow with the conjunction but. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. Nick Nolte's film, of course, National Treasure, wonderful line, right? No one writes, nobody talks like that anymore. I would argue, let's bring some of that back, and the civility that is buried nicely within this set of lines. Although, let's pay attention, clearly, Jefferson is making his argument. We cannot put up with it anymore. It is our right, it is our duty. The three elements, of course, that lead to the final famous fourth paragraph, or fourth part of this essay, let's just review it. One, the first and opening set of concepts, paragraph 1. Any time in history that it becomes necessary for a people to break those political bands, go back to the important symbolism of that notion of the slaves and the bands, those leather thongs that are holding together arms or feet. And to assume among the powers of the earth the sacred and equalization of the laws of nature, nature's God entitled them a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, declare they should impel the cause that impel them to the separation. That notion, in other words, part one. When you're going to leave and do what we're about to do, you need to explain why. Now, of course, we know that in the history of the world that was not the case, that in fact this is a highly enlightened notion, that you should explain the reasons for your decisions in a very articulated way, instead of just simply going to war. We know about the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille. Clearly the American intellectual movement was, we don't want to be perceived as just doing that. This is not light and transient causes, in other words. The second part of the essay, of course, establishes the powerful philosophic ideas. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Go back to our comments about the vague antecedent, that word we. We, of course, is a pronoun. It has an antecedent, but it hasn't been stated. We who hold these truths to be self-evident? The colonists, those in Parliament, all human minds that are capable of thought. It's a powerful use of this word, we. And of course, the powerful statements that will then begin that process, which is simply, really, when you reduce it down, humans have been endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. It's fascinating, as we said in our last lecture, in our previous lecture on the Declaration of Independence, that Scooby Snacks get into the Declaration of Independence. Happiness mentioned two different times. And then it's a very simple argument for Jefferson, as we've said in our earlier lecture. Very simple argument for him to say, this is what government is for, the securing of rights. When government no longer does that, it's the right of the people to first alter and then abolish. Notice the organization of those two words, alter and abolish. And then, of course, finally, if in fact it is the case that the tyrant has now no longer given us the ability to secure our rights, it is, again, our duty, our right and our duty to, in fact, do this. Now, the mention of the word duty, as we said in our earlier lecture, has everything to do with the reading of Immanuel Kant and the idea of duty. That notion of the categorical imperative, morally speaking. Go back and take a look at our comments there. Of course, the third part of this essay is then that listing, using anaphoria, as we said, of all the things George III has done, and of course that Parliament has allowed George III to do. That repetition, he has endeavored, he has obstructed, he has made judges, he has erected a multitude, he has affected to render, on and on. And then, of course, starting at paragraph 16, for quartering, for protecting, for cutting off, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, obviously one of the chief grievances. And on and on and on it goes. Then back again to paragraph 25. He has abdicated. He has plundered. He is at this time. He has constrained. He has excited. And on it goes, right? With finally the last then part of this powerful essay with this powerful conclusion. And I think it's significant for us to look now on page 79 of your text to the last paragraph, part 4, as many have constituted it as the Declaration of Independence, back to the pronoun we. And specifically, the antecedent is finally provided. The representatives of the United States of America and General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. Notice the supreme judge is that creator that has endowed us with inalienable rights. And as we said in our earlier lecture, one of the key questions is,